thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Yu, who's a good friend and a good colleague, and thanks to all of you for your decision both to be here today and to join the Navy or Marine Corps, whatever you go on to do, and to serve your country. I have no doubt in my mind that the Asia Pacific will be very important parts of your career. It's transforming quickly, as you've probably heard many times said, but I think it's really true, into a major, if not the major, arena of international political life as it unfolds over the next few years. My presentation will be based on the paper that I handed out, that I did with my colleague Aaron Friedberg from Princeton University and some others about an American strategy for Asia. But if I could, I want to start with a little bit of very contemporary history, and point something out and highlight something that I think is not highlighted enough, and that is that with this year and going into next year, we're going to be into starting the fourth decade without any major power war or major conflict in the Asia Pacific. Oftentimes we study why wars start. Too little do we study why war doesn't start and why peace breaks out for so long. And not only has there been peace, but the countries of the region have prospered. There's more advanced industrial democracies in that part of the world now than there are anywhere except for Europe. And none of this was a foregone conclusion in 1979 when the Chinese invaded Vietnam, and the United States was fearful in some quarters that we would be pulled into another great power war in Southeast Asia because the Soviets were backing the Vietnamese, and we had just started our rapprochement with China. At the same time, in the 79 to 80 time frame, we had just lost a brutal war in Vietnam, and were reeling from that. Both Presidents Nixon and Carter had announced, both explicitly and implicitly, that our commitments to our regional allies would be lessened. There was great fear in Japan and in South Korea, our traditional allies, that in fact we would pull back from the region, and President Carter, when he was elected, pledged to pull troops out of South Korea, which caused great panic in South Korea and Japan. So, and again, as I said before, the Chinese attack on Vietnam, which is understudied for geopolitical purposes, I think, how close the Soviets being put on alert, and once again, how close we could have been pulled into some kind of regional conflagration yet again in Southeast Asia. At the same time, internal stability within most of the allies was not assured. China was just starting its reform project under Deng Xiaoping, but it had just the Cultural Revolution in China had just ended, and the ravages of the Cultural Revolution were very much felt. People were writing the obituaries for Taiwan because we had just broken relations with Taiwan and formed relations with the People's Republic of China. South Korea was going through inner turmoil, both because of our announcement of a troop pullback, which didn't materialize but still caused a lot of panic within South Korea, as well as a burgeoning democracy movement in South Korea and an assassinated president. And again, as I said, Japan was very concerned about both the speed with which we went forward with our normalization with China, as well as the fact that the Soviets and their Vietnam ally at the time seemed to be on the march in Asia. So how was the peace won? You know, if you just go back to the headlines of 79 and 80, you would never think that this region would be what it is today. And I say for a few reasons. The first one is that an important consensus grew, in some senses bipartisan consensus, grew to beat back efforts to pull troops out of South Korea and to actually go forward with Nixon's so-called Guam doctrine, which would have called upon Asians to do more, with the implications that the U.S. would do less in the region in terms of our forward presence. By the early 1980s and the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act and the starting of rebuilding our military presence throughout the world, most of the allies felt once again that we were committed to the region and committed to protect them, to provide them with security. Second, throughout the 80s, the ultimate demise of the Soviet Union is an often overlooked factor in the stabilization of Asia. It's often looked at as stabilizing Europe and contributing to peace there, but if you look back at Soviet naval deployments and military presence within the region and the Sino-Soviet rift, the end of the Soviet Union, whose causes and purposes I will not get into here, it's a whole lecture series, I think, became very much a stabilizing factor. And the decision within the 1980s of countries such as Japan and South Korea to add to their own deterrent as we were adding to ours made a big difference in terms of how the Soviets thought they could play in the region and be destabilizing in the region. A third factor, I would say, is again this conscious commitment of the United States to rebuild its military presence, maintain its commitments, and basically provide for and produce for the security of the region. And also, I would say, to keep open its markets to Asian goods as the Asian countries were starting to really grow economically. There was a debate again within Washington about had the Asian nations been taken advantage of asymmetric access to the U.S. in terms of its markets and so forth, and that was settled, I think, responsibly in the United States in favor of keeping access open. Those two decisions in the United States to continue to provide the security umbrella, as well as to continue to lead in terms of trade liberalization, gave political leaders, some very sophisticated and good political leaders within Asia, the room and the space to make some very positive choices about their economic growth and political liberalization. By the early 1990s, as these factors started to come together, the Asian nations, the so-called Asian tigers, were the envy of the world in terms of their growth, in terms of their technological capabilities and so forth. It's also no accident, that the United States, within the region, each one of the independent powers, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, in particular, were all able to, but did not choose to develop nuclear weapons. There was diplomacy about, in some cases they were close, but U.S. diplomacy headed it off, and that is no small thing in a region that felt as insecure as it did. That's no accident. So by the end of the Cold War, the early 1990s, Asia looked very successful. China itself was booming economically. Japan was doing very well. South Korea was doing very well. Taiwan they were all doing very, very well. And the American public in general after the Cold War was looking for what was called the peace dividend. So once again, we entered a debate in the 1990s about coming back, pulling forces or diminishing forces in the Asia Pacific. We were back to getting into some very bitter fights with the Japanese about market access and trade, and in ways that was starting to really harm the alliance. But again, the responsibility of the political leadership back here decided that it was not worth getting into a real contretemps with Japan when the alliance had worked so well against the Soviets, and that once again, if we started to pull out our forces or think about diminishing our forces in South Korea and in Japan in particular, this would not conduce to the continued economic growth and political stability of the region. The other thing that happened is as the Russians were no longer posing a threat and in fact speaking very peacefully about the region, is that the North Koreans started to break their proliferation agreements and their agreements on the IAEA on nuclear issues, and China, as it grew in economic strength, started to grow in power as well. It started to grow in military power as well, and these events started to really focus the Allies and us on the need to continue our presence in East Asia. So we went through this other cycle in I'd say 1990 to 1996, 97 about whether or not it was worth it to stay so present in Asia, and we decided, particularly after the Chinese exercised a show of force in the Taiwan Strait in 1996, and the North Koreans became incredibly bellicose in 1994 and again in 1998. We, the Japanese, the South Koreans, Taiwanese, all focused on let's keep the U.S. presence as robust as it was during the Cold War, and not only that, but let's upgrade our alliance with our alliances across the board with Japan and South Korea, so that they have more capability to bring to bear as well. Things had changed. I touched on a bit. No longer was it the Soviets or the Soviets and the client states that we were worried about as we had been in the late 70s and 80s. It was the Chinese that were starting to give us and our allies pause. Contrary to the predictions of so many in the 1990s, so many China watchers and others, the Chinese actually have been behaving exactly as one might expect a great power to behave. A lot of people argue that this would not happen. They would somehow behave differently than the Americans behaved when they were becoming a great power, or that the Germans displayed or the Japanese displayed. But in fact, they're exhibiting what most in the region see as traditional great power behavior: more strength, more economic strength, more military strength, more ambition, more muscle flexing, and so on. So we made a decision in the mid-90s as a nation and with our allies that going forward with China, we would not just engage the Chinese as we had since President Nixon's opening up and President Carter's opening up to China, engage the Chinese in order to bring them into the family of nations, as President Nixon said, temper their aspirations, give them a stake in the international system, and all the rest of the purposes behind a very broad engagement strategy. But now we needed to also think about what happened if the Chinese grew too dominant in the region, and no one in the region wanted that. And there was a broad consensus that America must stay present in order to make sure that one underlying objective was carried out, and that is that no power in the region would dominate it. And this is very important in the Asia-Pacific region, because if you look at Asia's contemporary and modern history, the dominance by an outside power, or the dominance by an internal power, such as the Japanese or the Chinese beforehand, or the dominance by colonial powers, has always led to catastrophe and even war in Asia. So the basic idea that would underline the assumptions of the late 1990s and into the 21st century is we want an Asia that is not dominated by China, that is centered around a group of independent actors that cannot be coerced into decisions they don't want to make, and so forth. So again, in the late 90s, we began to expand these alliances. We began to talk a little bit more about hedging against the rise of China or maintaining a balance of power. It all meant the same thing. There were always going to be elements of both continued cooperation on some major issues, but there were always going to be also going to be some elements of containing China's expansion and always going to be elements of rivalry together with elements of cooperation. In essence, the decisions in the 90s and the 21st century rest, as I said, on some basic national security objectives, the first of which was no dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region, which meant a balance of power that favored us and our allies. The continued open free trade regime, open access, so that Asia didn't develop into groupings of exclusive economic blocs or military blocs. The continued open military access for us in the region to help ensure that the global commons, which I'm sure you study a lot, is open to all, and also to ensure that Asia. That the Asian countries that were not nuclear did not become nuclear. So in other words, to ensure that all the countries that had the capability still to become nuclear still relied upon our own extended nuclear guarantee, so that they didn't engage in these catastrophic arms races, which would be unmanageable and would probably harm the region's prosperity. So that's what we want to see. That's what we wanted to see. And the basic question is, how do you get there from here? That's obviously the essence of the strategy. We know I think you could probably get most policymakers in a room to agree on the basic objectives, but then what's the plan? And so going forward, I would say the key is going to be how we deal with China in the future. And as I said, they're acting very much like you'd expect a great rising power to act. That doesn't make it any less destabilizing, though. So first, I think we have to accept that they're acting not in ways that people predicted in the 90s, that they would just somehow accept the international system as it is and not try to change things more to their liking. They're actually things they really don't like about the international system and don't like about the status quo. So again, as I said, it's understandable, but it's destabilizing. We can see some of this Chinese unhappiness with the status quo in the specific ways that they're building their military capabilities to have greater control over their own periphery and make it harder for us to access areas and regions that we've always had access to. We can see this in the claims that they're making about what constitutes their own territory and charges that we are now acting in unlawful ways in their own territory, which obviously we disagree with. We can see this in the continued buildup of forces opposite of Taiwan, despite some reconciliation politically between Taiwan and China. We can see this in increased maritime activities over the last few years in East China Sea and Sea of Japan, and so on. So we will continue to engage with China. We're deeply economically interdependent with China, and the engagement is important for a multitude of reasons. You can't give up the idea that forces within China will accept that the way to greatness is through the acceptance of the basic international system, with perhaps more of a say in it rather than trying to change things through aggression. So we're going to be deeply engaged with China. We really are deeply engaged with China. The question is always going to be how to engage with China, how to engage with China on the basis of our principles as well as our interests. And in large measure, and this comes back to the start of what I was talking about. In large measure, we know how to do this because our policy has been remarkably successful over the last 30 years. You can't overstate the significance of maintaining those allies and making sure that the balance of power continues to be favorable to us and China can't dominate or coerce other countries. That there are strong independent actors in the Asia-Pacific region. Our forward presence and our nuclear deterrent, which is, I think, under some strain right now in terms of its credibility, are just key, especially as you face a North Korea that's now nuclear and a China that's going up in its nuclear forces. I think it's going to take a lot of work over the next 20 or so years to convince our allies that our extended deterrent guarantee is still what we say it is. there's we have to make sure, so there's this diplomatic work of tending to the alliances and keeping your powder dry. But there's also this tending constantly to the balance of military forces and making sure that your Pacific posture is continues to maintain the edge in the Asia Pacific, and everybody knows it, so that there's no temptation to aggression or to test us in that regard. Now, we'll try to like everything that we do. Of course not. Do we like everything that China does? No, not either. But they will respect it, I argue, more than they would respect just a pure strategy of accommodation, and that means the continuation of things that they don't like, particularly the selling of arms to Taiwan, and making sure that Taiwan remains strong, the continued allied building of relations with India and with Japan and with South Korea. But again, they will respect it and respect it more than a policy of pure accommodation. And also it will take some options off the table for China, so that this very dynamic society with all these competitive forces inside, rather than pushing the country in one way, will push the country to focus its energies on continued economic growth and technological dynamism. We have to keep this bipartisan consensus on leading on liberalizing trade in Asia. This is very important, because if you look at what's going on now in Asia, there's a danger that you are going to get these exclusive economic blocs that exclude the United States. So we have to. We're at another point in our history where the free trade and liberalization consensus is breaking down, and only we still have the power to make sure that Asia remains open to the globe and not exclusively Asian. As I said, we should not neglect our Pacific force structure, which is just very, very key. And we know how to keep the peace in Asia, because as I said, we have done so. The question is, will we have the political will, given so much that's going on in the world, to continue to do so in the next 20 or 30 years? And I'll stop there, unless you want me to go on.
Well, we can actually go to Q&A.
Okay. Sure.
Questions? I'll go first.
Okay.
Now, actually two questions. One is, how do you factor in the reality that Asia, particularly Asia, you've been talking about East Asia, there have been maturing democracies. With democracies, of course, you have uncertainties, unpredictable change of government.
Yeah.
And each change of government normally accompanies some kind of new foreign policy, particularly defense policy toward the United States, like what's going on in Japan, and in South Korea, and also Taiwan. And do we have, in your American policy toward Asia, is our plan B? In other words, if a new government comes in the democratic process, and they want to reduce or change the existing pattern of relationship between their country and the U.S. The second question is, in your Asia definition, do you factor in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and Indonesia, those Southeast Asian countries?
Yeah. On the first question, which is a very important one, particularly with what we see unfolding in Japan today, and really a political earthquake, the Democratic Party of Japan taking over after years and years of the LDP being in power, and a certain a basic understanding on alliances and so forth. I would say a couple things to that. One is, it's a very, very new government without much experience, and so we can't get ourselves into a panic quite yet. I mean, these are people who need to figure out the basics of governing, and there's all kinds of policies they're putting forward with respect to having a East Asia community that excludes the United States, which even the Chinese and the Australians have said that's not such a great idea. So they're going to go through they're going to hit some road bumps, and they're going to have to shift matters. You know, this is just like any democratic politics. You come in with all kinds of soaring rhetoric about the things you want to do, and then you sort of get mugged by reality, and you say, well, you know, we can't quite move Japan we can't put it on a bunch of tugboats and move it to Europe. It's right here in Asia, and we still have missiles pointed at us in North Korea, and we still have the Chinese submarine fleet being built, and you know, over time, my expectation, my analysis is some of those impulses will moderate. We certainly have gone through this with South Korea. There was a real panic. In just a few years back with President No of South Korea, and people really thought the alliance was, you know, people were talking about the end of the alliance. But you know, you have to recall that at the same time that President No in South Korea was playing to his base in South Korea and saying all these things about the United States and really playing the anti-America card, which was popular at the time. At the same time, Korea sent troops to Iraq to join coalition forces, sent troops to Afghanistan, and negotiated the largest free trade agreement in Asia's history. Now, we didn't ratify it, but you know, this was all under the anti-American president, right? So, again, I'm of the view that, you know, we've gone through this with Schroeder's Germany. We've gone through this with many different allies. Democratic allies are not the easiest allies, but they're the most stable allies. So there'll be a debate within Japan, and to the extent we can shape it, I don't know. I think it'll take a lot of time to figure out how to shape that debate. But you know, I think the real world will have a moderating impact on some of the rhetoric coming out 2 months after the election. When I talk about Asia, it's very, you know, because people also say, well, that's your second question. You know, what about India? And I do talk about India. I see it as a region where, you know, there's a number of great powers with an interest in a particular geographic area. So you have India with an increasing interest in East Asia. And most people would say they're a South Asian country, but there's an increasing interest in what China is doing and maintaining a balance of power with China. There's an increased interest in trade in Southeast Asia. And so you have to now say that India is an East Asian power as well. With countries like Australia, I mean, a lot of these divisions are made to make it easier for the U.S. government to divide up, you know, who's going to do what. But so a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, for example, especially those with important access to sea lanes of communication and the Malacca Straits and the Lombok Straits are also very interested in what the Chinese and the Americans will do in the future to keep those sea lanes safe. The Australians are, you know, a global power with great interests in East Asia as well. So you know, I would include any one of those countries and you know, any one of those countries that has great economic and political interests within that geographic expanse. Other questions?
You mentioned China's growing conventional might in the form of submarines. I've heard estimates around 5 per year, as well as our need to upkeep nuclear deterrence in the region. Do you think that our global engagements right now, like Afghanistan, are detracting from that, and should we be more focused on those sorts of threats?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, unfortunately, we're the only country with global capabilities and global responsibilities, so we don't have luxuries of making those trade-offs. And in foreign policy, everything affects everything, really. So if we were to retrench, in my opinion, from commitments in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are smack in Central Asia, you would see some pretty harmful effects in East Asia, both because of in Southeast Asia in particular, concerns about radicalism and Islamic radicalism, as well as China's behavior as they border those nations and have increased interest in Central Asia. So you know, I think that I mean, are they a distraction? In practice, yes, just because it's only so many things a group of cabinet officials can focus on every day. In theory, they shouldn't be. You know, I think that the capabilities that are being used in Afghanistan and Pakistan are not the kinds of capabilities we need to have in the Pacific. You know, larger fleets, larger submarine forces, missile defenses, air power, and that sort of thing. So in theory, you can find a way if as a nation we were willing to properly resource our defense, our national objectives, then in theory the answer to your question is no. Is it happening? To some extent, it is happening. What you're saying, which is that we're looking at it more and more as a zero sum. If you do this much in Afghanistan, you do this much less in Asia Pacific. But that's why I'm sort of making this clarion call to say we can't afford to do that, because although Asia has been at peace for 30 years, there's so many factors involved right now that it doesn't mean it'll stay that way.
Professor, you had mentioned in your introduction that you just came out with a report on cybersecurity, and I was wondering how you think we should counteract China's rising threat in that realm.
Well, this is one of the most important and complicated realms of warfare, and it's an ongoing. Anyone who says that China's a sort of a future issue in terms of the military realm, at least, you know, isn't working at DoD or in the military, where it's a daily, an ongoing struggle to everything from make sure that your networks are secure and not penetrated to other types of thoughts about what warfare in the cyber realm means, and nobody knows exactly what warfare in the cyber realm means. The Chinese often talk about things like dominating the electromagnetic spectrum, but nobody really can figure out what it means to dominate. It's not like the air or the water. You know, I don't think there's such thing as cyber supremacy in that sense. But to counter, you know, there's an offensive defensive, as probably all of you know, capability. You know, the issuing public reports is one way to issuing detailed and factual and sober public assessments is one way to sort of tell the Chinese to knock it off, because they don't like at this point in China's career as a great power, they don't like to be associated with that sort of behavior. You know, they want it to be not as noticed by the American public. At the military realm, obviously things get classified pretty quickly, but I think there has to be a lot more thought to what constitutes acts of war, what constitutes proportionate responses. You know, I think General Cartwright, who's now the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was doing a lot of thinking about this and trying to talk to the Chinese about what this means if you actually go forward and take out an electricity grid and people die because of that, and you know, how does the U.S. respond to that? And so this is really a new area of warfare.
Do you think we should be willing to take it outside that medium in retaliation?
Well, again, it depends, right? I mean, it depends on you know, I mean, there's all kinds of problems with attribution, and there's all kinds of problems with intentionality, but I would not take that option off the table, you know, ever. And so, you know, that's an area with China that it's difficult enough to talk to the Chinese about maritime issues and proper maritime behavior. This one's going to be even more difficult because both of us are developing new capabilities in that arena.
Sir, with regards at least to commerce, one of the major stabilizing factors right now in Asia is the U.S. 7th Fleet. With the rising power in China, do you think we can start seeing a cooperation between our fleet and their fleet as far as actions taken to keep the region stable? And a second question, I'm not sure it is about the classification of any of this, but in the near future we can expect that there's going to be drastic technological advances that will allow U.S. submarines to communicate at speed and depth. And that's going to change the physics of the battlefield, obviously. I was wondering how if China's going to be able to respond to it, and how does that change their strategic action in the Pacific?
Mm-hmm. Well, on the first issue, we've been quite eager over the last few years to include China in more confidence-building measures at sea, and I mean it sort of starts at very basic levels, like incidents at sea, or protocols at sea, or accidents at sea. Certainly, these things have heightened since more incidents have happened with the USS Impeccable, for example, and so forth. And so we're quite eager to engage China in these kinds of discussions about what is and isn't lawful, and how to actually go through a set of protocols to make sure that we avoid accidents. So that starts at the most basic level of let's just not bump into each other and get into something we don't want to get into. On the actual level of cooperation, we've been quite eager to cooperate with China. You see this in the exercise, the anti-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Aden, which we've encouraged and are actually working closely with, I understand, the Chinese on anti-piracy efforts. We still have prohibitions in the law that I think are germane in the National Defense Authorization Law in terms of actually doing things that might give the Chinese advantage in terms of giving them operational or tactics and techniques and that sort of thing. So we have to be very careful of that. And this is one of those dilemmas of we're neither friend nor foe, we're kind of both, and so we're really unsure about the eventual strategic direction of China. So certain public goods like humanitarian relief and counter piracy seem obvious, but other things I think are a little bit more difficult. And also the Chinese have been less forthcoming and less willing to cooperate, because the distrust within their military is much greater than the distrust within our own military. So much less forthcoming about cooperating. In terms of specific submarine technologies, my experience with the Chinese is that there's certainly certain capabilities you can bring to bear that sort of keep this at a very general level, but that they respond to. There's certain things that they think we can do that give them pause, which is good, I think, for deterrence. And the question is always how to demonstrate those and how to use them in a way that. And then there's certain things that they just very actively work around. I mean, it used to be that they were terrified of the U.S. carrier strike force, and now they've busily spent the last 10 or 15 years making that strike force vulnerable. So it depends on the particular capability, and it depends on the kind of value structure within the Chinese military. What do they fear the most? What do they hold most valuable, and what do they think we can do about it?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your talk, so I apologize if you
That's okay.
covered this. But I read a lot about the heavy Chinese investment in foreign countries such as Iran and their energy, and some African states, and I think even South America. Do we view that as a threat, or just one of those things that rising great powers do, and we don't really concern ourselves with it?
Well, I'll give you my own view. I mean, each place is different. I mean, with Iran, as most permanent members of the Security Council are trying to get get Iran to at least hold the risk of sanctions against Iran in case these talks don't work out on nuclear disarmament. There you get a sort of nuisance. Well, more than a nuisance. I mean, you get an obstacle because the Chinese would probably be more reluctant than the Russians to do anything that might harm their energy and oil interests. And if you talk to the Chinese about it, they don't see that as they don't see Iran as their problem. They see it as so far away, and they don't really believe that the U.S. or any of its allies will do anything about it anyway, and so it just doesn't concern them, and they'll continue. So Iran is kind of a special case. In terms of the investments in other places, I don't particularly see that as a threat. I mean, I think there's certain areas where I would say it could be threatening in the sense that they're destabilizing. There's a kind of simmering rivalry with the Indians, and it's getting a little bit more heated. Both in terms of the north between India and China and some of those border areas, as well as maritime competition close to the Straits of Malacca. And the Indians are very concerned about Chinese, what they see as Chinese building of installations in some of the places naval installations that they've invested heavily in as well. So in terms of the factor of destabilization, where you don't want two great emerging powers to get into any kind of hot conflict over things, then I would say that is destabilizing. But again, it just depends where. I mean, in other places, I mean, if my view is that if the Chinese want to throw a whole lot of money at a sinkhole in Africa, because they think that buys them more energy security, have at it. It's waste your money and it's not going to get you very much.
Are we doing anything like that?
Well, we used to, but we've all tried our hand at colonialism and mercantilism in Africa, and it never works out well for anybody. I mean, we try as a country, we try to hold to the ideal that there's an energy market out there, and that we're gonna act in market-based ways. And we don't always act like that, obviously, but we don't do these kinds of deals that the Chinese major oil companies do, which come with a lot of benefits for the governments in Africa and infrastructure and that sort of thing. I mean, our energy companies are more or less on their own if they want to go into those places.
You talked about China as showing a lot of signs as a rising power, and you talked about sort of our attempt to hedge this rising power and to sort of contain that within their general region.
Yeah.
This is also sort of an area where we as a great power are expressing our own influence in their region.
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be a time when we're going to have to sit down and face them face to face and accept them as a great power? I mean, we've been talking about the G2, and do you think there's a time where we have to stop that and treat them as not an equal, more as an equal?
Well, I think there's a lot of elements in our policy and strategy that do that already and have done that for a long time. And in fact, uniquely among established great powers, we've actually said, please join this organization, and please join that organization, and please have a seat at this table, and please have a seat at that table, and please join the WTO. I mean, we've sort of done a lot to help them enhance their economic growth quite a bit, and specifics on the G2, would make a lot of people more nervous, because you also always have to remember that Asia is not just China, and a lot of the other countries would say G2. I mean, that's not what we want. I mean, we don't want the U.S. and China, any sign that the U.S. and China is dividing up this region or controlling our fates. So, in many ways, we should and are treating China as an equal. In terms of, is this their region or our region, our own key national security objective, I think is to make sure it's nobody's region. I mean, it's a region of and everybody's region, right? So it's a region of the Japanese and the Australians and the Indians and the Chinese and the Taiwanese and none of those countries can be coerced into doing things they don't want to do. And the reason that we're more accepted in the region, let's say, I went through some of the history where we wanted to pull back and countries invited us back in, is because we're viewed as relatively more distant and relatively more benign, and the provider of basic public security goods. Now, if the Chinese really changed over time and said, we got it, guys, we're going to take care of it in a way that makes everybody very comfortable, it's going to be an international trading order, not a Chinese exclusive zone, and it's going to be we're going to actually provide the public goods of sea line safety and so forth. If we get to that day, it'll be a very happy day. The way the Chinese are acting right now, I don't see that.
You kind of talked about the United States basically maintaining the status quo in its policy in Asia. And I was just wondering what your recommendations would be if the status quo is no longer feasible. Both, you talked about the importance of maintaining all these relationships, but you're also having China increasing its relative power relative to many of those nations and relative to us. And you also have the effects of the global financial crisis, where the United States, you might have slashed defense budgets, maybe not the ability to maintain the same capabilities in Asia. So what should we do if we can no longer maintain the status quo in our policy towards Asia?
Yeah, I'd stay away from status quo, because the United States is such a kind of energetic power that we never maintain the status quo, except on the most basic types of things in the Asia Pacific. Like, the alliance structure has held pretty steady since the end of World War II. The post-World War II economic regime, liberalizing economic regime, has held pretty steady. Our basic desire to see more advanced industrial democracies be part of this international system. There's some basic things that are status quo, but it's a very dynamic region, so you can't. There really is no status quo. And when I use the word status quo, I meant that the Chinese might not like elements of what I just described. That it's also the fact that the U.S. has been so military predominant in the region that we operate very close to where they are now. Of course, we see it as providing a public good to the region. They see it as we're getting too close in their faces. I think it would be very dangerous if we didn't maintain just the most basic elements of our policy, which is, if we took the global recession as a sign that we're in decline and have to retrench. If the war weariness with respect to Afghanistan and Iraq meant less of an appetite for keeping the types of defense budgets we need, particularly in the naval and air realm in the Asia Pacific. I think we'd see a very dangerous Asia. I think we'd see an Asia that focused on military competition more than on trade. I think we'd see more nuclear powers in Asia. I think it'd have an effect on the global trading system as a whole. So, Dr. Yu asked about a plan B. We really don't have one. I mean, particularly if things with Japan go badly, if things with Japan go really badly, which I don't think they will, then we're kind of back to December 6, 1941 in terms of our basic position. Hawaii and maybe Australia, and that I think is very dangerous.
Do you think could a plan B possibly be trying to increase our support for India as a counterweight to China, or is there the risk that India wouldn't comply based on their non-interference policy, and also that China could just leave China to be more aggressive?
I think that's part of our plan A. So what we're trying to do is as our relative worldwide strength is less, not absolute, but relative to countries such as China and Europe and in its own way, and India, is to try to build up partners and allies in the region and hand off a little bit more of the security work to them, through these webs of partnerships. And I think it's very important, India in particular, because it has the strength and the resolve to make sure that nobody dominates the region. Now we don't want to take it too far because we don't want them to dominate the region either, and we don't want India and China to get into some kind of major power war. But I think that the basic maintaining that balance of power, India starts to become key. But that's Plan A. Plan B is if we no longer look like a reliable security partner for India, and then they're unhinged to us as well.
You talked about, and over the next 20 years, we have a lot of reassurances to give to our allies about the reliability of our extended deterrent. President Obama taking steps to decrease our nuclear arsenal with START 2 and CTBT and everything. Would you say how important is our nuclear arsenal to maintaining the balance of power in the region, and also to just our general alliances with Japan and South Korea?
Well, they're key. Former Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger says, correctly, I think, that nuclear weapons are in fact used every day. I mean, just the knowledge that they're on our submarines or on our airplanes gives all of our allies the reassurance on a daily basis that we're there, and I personally don't believe that a peace keeps itself, right? I mean, any potential adversary knows that this deterrent is there and everywhere, and they're not actually used as an exploded every day, but they're used every day in the sense of keeping the peace, and once people begin to question that, I'll take the case of North Korea, for example, and somewhat of a crisis with the Japanese. I mean, we promised the Japanese throughout the 90s and the North Korea would never have nuclear weapons, and lo and behold, they have nuclear weapons. So right there, that harms the alliance. That harms the credibility of the alliance, and I think that plays some part in Japanese domestic politics, which is just how reliable are these guys. In the sense that you can now make the argument in Japan that, number one, these guys are heavy-handed and we want more of an equal relationship, and we want the Marines out of Okinawans. Number two, they're not that reliable anyway. So I just think it's key. It's not something that I don't think we're in some kind of new world order where these traditional instruments of power politics won't matter anymore. Particularly in Asia, they'll matter a lot. Let's see, somebody else who didn't ask.
Along a little different line, countries like China now are facing increasing issues of food shortages, and we're still paying farmers not to grow crops in the U.S. Do you see any potential to increase our agricultural exports to Asia, or if not agriculture, maybe some other sector where we can increase trade?
Well, you're getting to areas that I don't really know, but that doesn't usually stop people from Washington from talking about them anyway. I'll just take the issue of market access in general in Asia, not just in China, but China is in particular. I personally believe very strongly that we have to continue to work to keep our markets open and work very hard to keep their markets open. And it's not just in agriculture; it's in the most high value-added goods that the United States makes. You couldn't buy an iPhone in China until this year, even though it was until they, to be ungenerous, until they figured out how to knock it off, and yeah, until today, okay, until they figured out how to make a knockoff, and now it's not that valuable. But that kind of thing does not, that harms our economic well-being. It's not just China. It's a lot of Asian countries. We had a deliberate policy after the Cold War to particularly with Japan and some of our Cold War allies, to allow them access to our markets without asking for reciprocity. And those days are ending. But on the other hand, we're the ones right now without a trade policy. We have this huge free trade agreement with Korea just sitting there in the Congress, and that if that thing is ratified, it could open up a lot of markets to us. So I can't answer your question directly, but we need to make sure that this open trading regime continues.
Yeah. I'm not really comfortable still with your assumption that the U.S. presence in Asia is necessary to maintain peace and stability and economic prosperity in the region. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah. I would say that the strategic tasks that the United States, let's just say the military does in Asia, no one else is doing and no one else can do at this point in time. So on a day in, day out basis, the Pacific Command is doing everything from monitoring the sea lanes to make sure there's 90% or so of the world's trade comes through some of the straits inside of Southeast Asia, and those have to be monitored. Those countries' navies have to be trained. We're doing that. Humanitarian relief, and inside of Indonesia and other places, we're doing that. Making sure that the Chinese don't attack Taiwan, which would be very destabilizing. We're doing that. Making sure that the Chinese know they can't take things too far with the Japanese inside of the East China Sea and some of those disputed areas. A presence in the South China Sea, where there's a lot of disputes still with Vietnam and China and other places. Areas that are important to us because so much commerce and trade goes through. We're doing those strategic tasks as well. I don't see anyone on the horizon, who is willing or able to provide those public goods which benefit us as well. We benefit greatly from the increased trade and commerce in East Asia, the basic stability and peace in East Asia. The peace didn't happen by accident. There were times where they're very close to going to war. The other thing is, if you imagine in Asia where Japan, South Korea, Australia all developed nuclear weapons, and all had suspicions of China or of each other in some cases. I mean, you'd be talking about a pre-First World War Europe, in my opinion, on steroids, just unmanageable. I don't think balances of powers just occur. I think U.S. predominance has given the countries the confidence to make the right choices. If we were in a situation, let's say, when America was rising and the UK could sort of slowly give us, but there was so much trust between the two of us, and America was willing to do those tasks, I don't see anyone else who's willing to do them.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up, and I'm a historian, so I can say much of the discussion is really about this age-old American foreign policy, which actually was initiated because of events in China about 109 years ago. That's during the Boxer Rebellion. It's called open door policy. Open door policy foundation basically is about maintaining territorial integrity of China. Nobody wants to be dominant over that region. Secondly, equal opportunity in commerce. So everybody has equal chance. So I think in that sense, that I also have the thought about this Plan B. I had an idea. I thought our Plan B has always been a semi-inhabitable, overly crowded island of Guam.
That's Plan A. It was part of Plan A. That again brings you back to December 6, 1940.
That's right. Well, thank you very much, Dan, and that's a very enlightening conversation. Also, thank you for your contribution.
Thank you for your questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.